Recently, in Ouagadougou, a thunderous announcement shook Africa. 100,000 tons of fish worth $200 million harvested in a land with no sea. For Burkina Faso, this was not just food, it was freedom. Once dependent on Ghana and Côte d'Ivoire, its rivers dried and its people went hungry. Now Captain Ibrahim Traore declares fish stronger than gold or oil. But can a tilapia truly shield a nation's sovereignty? Can rivers feed a future no foreign power controls? Together, let's dive deeper into the story behind this harvest. If you believe food is sovereignty, type yes in the comments. Your voice matters here. Subscribe now and be part of this journey for a stronger, sovereign Africa. The story begins not with a military parade or a gold mine discovery, but with something far humbler, a net full of fish. Recently, in Ouagadougou, Burkina Faso announced that its reservoirs and rivers had produced 100,000 tons of fish, valued at $200 million. The figures alone were astonishing. This was a landlocked country with no coastline, long dismissed as too dry and too poor to dream of feeding itself from water. Yet here was proof in numbers, weight, and smell. Fish markets overflowing, smoke from drying racks rising above villages, boats once abandoned now leaning heavy with the day's catch. For many Burkinabe, this announcement was nothing short of a declaration of independence. To grasp the magnitude of this moment, one must remember the hunger that shaped Burkina Faso's modern history. For decades, fish on the dinner table was not a given, but a luxury. The country depended on imports from Ghana and Côte d'Ivoire. Trucks carrying frozen tilapia and sardines rolled across borders, and when political tensions or price shocks hit, markets in Ouagadougou went empty. Fishermen gave up their trade as rivers dried and dams silted. Families fell back on monotonous diets of millet and sorghum, and children grew up without knowing the taste of protein-rich stew. Hunger became not just a humanitarian crisis, but a threat to national security. A country that could not feed itself was a country that would always remain vulnerable. Captain Ibrahim Traore put it in words that cut through statistics and speeches. "If our people go hungry," he declared, "every school, every hospital, every road is meaningless." For him, sovereignty was not only about borders or armies, it was about ensuring that the ordinary citizen did not collapse from malnutrition. Choosing fish as the weapon against hunger was deeply symbolic. Gold, the country's most famous export, enriches a small elite and quickly leaves the nation in bullion trucks or offshore accounts. Oil, when found, can be stolen or controlled by multinational contracts. But fish is different. Fish feeds everyone, from a hungry schoolchild to a grandmother selling smoked fillets in the market. The plan was both technical and cultural. Scientists and agronomists sat with policymakers to choose species that could survive and thrive in Burkina Faso's reservoirs and ponds. Tilapia, already beloved in local cuisine, proved resilient in village cages. Carp, fast-growing, matched the scale of man-made lakes. Catfish, rich in protein and adaptable, became the backbone of smaller ponds and home-based production. As one biologist remarked at the launch, "We are not importing tastes, we are restoring dignity." Each species carried with it a promise of both survival and familiarity, food that fit Burkinabe hands, pots, and memories. The declaration came alive in a scene that many described as almost religious. On the banks of Lake Bagre, thousands of citizens gathered in late August. Farmers, children, and elders waited as government trucks backed up to the water. Crates were opened and silver streams of fingerlings cascaded into the lake. The crowd erupted not as though they were watching a technical restocking project, but a baptism of the nation itself. Children clapped as the fish scattered. Women sang traditional songs. Elders poured water over their hands, blessing the moment. A fisherman in Bobo Dioulasso held his catch with tears in his eyes and said, "At last, we eat from our waters, not another man's sea." It was a ritual of rebirth, and its message was unmistakable. Burkina Faso would no longer let hunger dictate its sovereignty. Food was not charity. It was not an imported solution. It was national policy woven directly into the fabric of daily life. The symbolism ran deeper still. For years, the wealth of Burkina Faso, cotton, gold, livestock, had flowed outward. Cotton bales traveled to foreign mills, gold bars disappeared into vaults in Europe, even beef often fed markets abroad rather than local households. The profits left little behind. But fish was different. It was immediate, tangible, and consumed by ordinary people. It could not be siphoned into foreign accounts or shipped in bulk to faraway cities. Fish stayed home. Fish meant a child eating a hot meal tonight, a mother earning steady income tomorrow, and a community finding strength in its own rivers rather than in imported crates. This inversion of value shook traditional narratives of power. For generations, sovereignty was measured by tanks, treaties, or mineral reserves. But now, Traore was insisting on a new definition. A country that fills its stomachs is stronger than a country that fills its arsenals. One teacher in Koudougou summarized the philosophy perfectly. You cannot defend a nation whose children faint from hunger, but you can defend a nation that eats from its own rivers. The harvest then was not just about tons of tilapia and carp. It was about dignity. Villages once abandoned now hummed with activity again. Rivers that had seemed lifeless now shimmered with silver movement. Songs long forgotten were heard once more by the water's edge. The political speeches could have been dismissed as propaganda, but the return of fish to plates made the promise undeniable. International analysts, particularly in Western capitals, were quick to scoff. Fish cannot build a nation, one report argued. Commentators in Paris and Washington framed the initiative as populism, an emotional spectacle rather than an economic strategy. Yet in Burkina Faso's villages, people laughed at such arrogance. To them, a full plate of food was more revolutionary than 100 speeches. Justice did not come in treaties or conferences, but in the simple reality of eating from one's own river. This was the beginning of a new chapter. The nets were heavy, the markets alive, and the symbolism as powerful as the statistics. But as every Burkinabe knew, the deeper question loomed: could this victory last? Could the fish offensive become not just a miracle harvest, but a lasting system? A shield not only against hunger, but against dependence itself. Do you think fish can truly become more powerful than gold or oil? Drop your thoughts in the comments, but that was only the beginning. The real test came when people tried to build a system around it. What began as a symbolic restocking of rivers soon unfolded into a living, breathing economy. The government knew that pouring fingerlings into lakes was not enough. For the project to endure, people needed skills, tools, and systems to carry it forward. So training programs were launched across provinces. Extension agents on motorbikes traveled from village to village, showing farmers how to build floating cages, how to regulate oxygen in ponds, how to spot and treat diseases before they wiped out stocks. In schools and community centers, workshops taught the basics of aquaculture management. Lessons once confined to textbooks now became the daily knowledge of ordinary farmers. The transformation was especially striking among women. Long relegated to the margins of agriculture, they suddenly found themselves at the center of a new economy. Women's associations received microloans from the state to build smoking stations and drying racks. With access to these facilities, fresh fish could be turned into smoked fillets that lasted weeks instead of days. What once spoiled in 2 days, tomatoes, vegetables, fragile products, was replaced by fish that traveled across regions, reaching urban centers and sustaining profit flows. Women who once carried baskets of perishable crops now became traders of a resilient commodity. In markets from Ouagadougou to Kaya, they were no longer merely subsistence farmers, they were business owners. As one cooperative leader put it with pride, "Before we sold tomatoes that spoiled in 2 days. Now smoked fish travels for weeks. Our profit is steady. Our respect has grown." For the fishermen, the change was both economic and emotional. Many had walked away from their nets years earlier, when rivers yielded only weeds and empty baskets. But now they returned, their boats leaning low in the water, nets heavy with tilapia and catfish. Along the banks, old songs of the river were heard again. One fisherman, Issou from Bama, told reporters, "We are fishermen once more. Our children will not just hear stories, they will live them." His words carried the weight of an entire generation rediscovering its identity. Children were among the first to feel the benefits. At a primary school in Koudougou, steaming pots of fish stew became part of the daily meal program. Teachers noted sharper attention, fewer absences, more energy in the playground. "When they eat fish, they do not sleep through lessons," explained Madame Ouedraogo, the headmistress. For a country where malnutrition had been a silent epidemic, the presence of protein in school meals was a quiet revolution. Development experts could publish all the reports they wanted, but in classrooms filled with alert, healthy children, the evidence spoke for itself. Markets, too, pulsed with a new rhythm. In Ouagadougou's central square, stalls brimmed with baskets of fresh tilapia, slabs of smoked catfish, and jars of fish or oil. Buyers haggled, sellers sang out prices, and the smell of wood smoke mixed with river air. The money earned here did not vanish into foreign accounts. It circulated locally. Families with steady catches purchased plows for their fields, seeds for the next planting season, or even motorbikes to connect with markets farther away. Small clinics in provincial towns reported higher attendance because people could finally afford medicine. A phrase began to circulate: the fish economy. It was not just about food, it was about the cascade of opportunities that a steady local resource could unleash. The sentiment of the people was captured in a simple phrase that echoed in villages and markets alike: gold leaves, fish stays. Gold, the country's traditional export, was always destined for foreign vaults. Fish, by contrast, stayed on Burkinabe plates in Burkinabe pockets, and within Burkinabe communities. It was a currency of survival, pride, and independence all at once. Yet beyond statistics and slogans, it was the human stories that gave the project its power. In Tenko, a mother who once scraped by selling tomatoes now paid her children's school fees on time thanks to her smoked fish business. In Kaya, a young man who nearly migrated to Europe for work stayed home to build fish cages with his friends. In Bobo Dioulasso, fishermen who had given up years ago returned to the rivers, singing as their boats groaned under new weight. Each of these moments stitched together a larger narrative: that sovereignty was no longer an abstract idea, but something people could taste, sell, and live. The impact rippled outward. Nutrition surveys showed measurable improvements in protein intake, particularly among children in pilot provinces. Economists noted the stabilizing of prices as domestic supply met demand. Social scientists observed an intangible but powerful effect: morale. Hope, or once scarce, began to circulate again, just like the fish in village ponds. This was the climax of the initiative, the point where policy leapt from paper into kitchens, schools, and markets. What began as a decree signed in June had become an economy in motion. The people, once skeptical of government promises, were now participants in a system they could see and touch. To dismiss it as symbolism, as foreign analysts often did, was to ignore the full baskets in Ouagadougou's markets and the satisfied faces in its classrooms. The fish had become more than a harvest, they had become a declaration, and the question, once whispered only by officials, now echoed in the voices of everyday citizens. Could a simple tilapia change more lives than a ton of gold? Could a simple tilapia change more lives than a ton of gold? If you believe it's possible, say Traore in the comments. While villages were celebrating, global capitals were reacting very differently. While villages in Burkina Faso celebrated full nets and steaming pots of fish stew, reactions abroad took a very different tone. In Western capitals, analysts and think tanks moved quickly to frame the success story in skeptical terms. Reports from Paris and Washington branded the program unsustainable, warning that intensive aquaculture in fragile Sahelian ecosystems would lead to ecological collapse. Editorials predicted that lakes would suffer from algae blooms, that water levels would decline under climate stress, and that overfishing would return with even sharper consequences. To them, the sight of fish markets overflowing in a landlocked country was not evidence of resilience but a temporary spectacle. Yet the data contradicted these gloomy forecasts. Within months of the initiative's launch, imports of fish into Burkina Faso dropped by double digits. Market surveys documented stable prices across rural and urban areas, where volatility once drove families to desperation. Nutrition reports confirmed measurable improvements in child growth indicators in provinces where fish became part of school meal programs. To families who had long measured wealth not in numbers but in whether children went to bed hungry, these figures spoke volumes. The Western warnings seemed less like science and more like a refusal to accept that an African-led model could work without external instruction. Across Africa, the reaction was not ridicule, but curiosity. Ministers from Mali, Niger, and Togo traveled to Burkina Faso's reservoirs to see the cages, the cold storage facilities, and the training programs firsthand. In Bamako, newspapers asked why Mali could not replicate the program. Farmers in Niamey demanded similar investments in their reservoirs. Journalists coined a new phrase: fish diplomacy. Just as oil once defined power in the Gulf and grain shaped relations between Russia and Europe, fish now began to emerge as a new currency of influence in West Africa. The symbolism was striking: a landlocked nation long dismissed as peripheral had transformed freshwater aquaculture into a geopolitical tool. For decades, Africa had been taught to look outward, export raw materials, import food, depend on aid. Burkina Faso was flipping the script. By feeding itself, it was not only reducing vulnerability, but also exporting an idea. And ideas, once proven, are harder to contain than any shipment of goods. This is precisely why the program unsettled traditional powers. Institutions like the IMF and World Bank had long promoted structural reforms that pushed poor nations to cut subsidies, liberalize food imports, and prioritize export crops. Burkina Faso had chosen the opposite path: invest directly in food self-sufficiency, subsidize hatcheries, and build local markets. The results embarrassed critics who had insisted that self-reliance in such a context was impossible. Suddenly, a model existed that did not require the traditional Western playbook. For the United States, the implications were especially uncomfortable. American think tanks warned of a dangerous precedent. If Burkina Faso's model succeeded, other African nations might decide to bypass IMF and World Bank loans, rejecting the usual strings attached. Aid conditionalities, often framed as good governance incentives, could lose their leverage. Washington analysts fretted that if food sovereignty became the new definition of independence, then the carefully constructed architecture of aid dependency could begin to crumble. If fish can replace aid, one report asked bluntly, what's next? In this sense, fish became more than food. It became a diplomatic instrument. Foreign delegations arrived in Ouagadougou not to lecture, but to learn. Regional summits included aquaculture alongside discussions of trade and security. Burkina Faso, a country once viewed as a student in global governance, was suddenly cast as a teacher. As one villager proudly remarked, "We used to copy others, now others copy us." The phrase captured a shift not only in agriculture, but in confidence. Globally, the comparison was clear. Oil diplomacy had once reshaped the Gulf into a center of power. Grain diplomacy gave Russia leverage over Europe. Now, in its own modest but meaningful way, fish was emerging as Africa's unique contribution to the geopolitics of resources. A country with no sea was using ponds and lakes to redefine sovereignty. What outsiders dismissed as fragile or symbolic was becoming, at least in West Africa, a catalyst for new alliances. The image of fish as a tool of independence spread beyond policy papers into cultural consciousness. Social media across the continent buzzed with hashtags celebrating Africa feeds itself. Videos of women traders smoking fish in new facilities circulated widely, praised not only as business success but as symbols of dignity. The narrative contrasted sharply with Western portrayals of fragility and dependence. In African eyes, this was not populism. It was proof that sovereignty could be cooked, eaten, and shared. Still, risks remained. Environmentalists warned of overstocking lakes and the dangers of ecological imbalance. Economists questioned whether Burkina Faso could scale production without becoming dependent again on imported fish feed. Diplomats wondered whether regional admiration could survive once competition for markets intensified. But whatever the risks, the precedent had been set. Food security could be treated as national defense, and aquaculture could function as foreign policy. For Western powers, the dilemma was clear. To dismiss the project as unsustainable was to ignore the evidence of fuller markets and healthier children. To acknowledge it as a success was to admit that Africa could craft solutions outside the structures of global aid and governance. For many in the global South, the lesson was obvious. Sovereignty begins with the ability to feed your people. Is this Africa rewriting the rules of sovereignty or just another fragile gamble? If you believe it's real, type Amen. And as rivers filled with life again, politics could no longer stay the same. The true measure of a policy is not in press releases or official decrees, but in whether it reshapes daily life. In Burkina Faso, the fish offensive began doing just that. What started as ponds filling with tilapia soon transformed into something harder to quantify, but more profound: trust. For years, trust in government had been a fragile commodity. Burkina Faso endured repeated coups, internal conflict, and cycles of broken promises. Citizens often viewed state announcements with skepticism, assuming that benefits would never reach ordinary families. Yet the arrival of fish on plates changed that calculation. In villages where children had gone to bed hungry, families could now cook stews rich in protein. In city markets once emptied by import shortages, stalls overflowed with fresh catches. Suddenly, people judged the government not by rhetoric, but by what they could see and eat. Civil servants themselves felt a new sense of pride. Teachers who had watched students drift through lessons on empty stomachs now saw sharper focus and better attendance. Nurses at rural clinics reported fewer cases of malnutrition. Even bureaucrats long accused of inefficiency found themselves linked to a tangible success story. For once, their work was not lost in paperwork but manifested in full classrooms and healthier children. It was as if the machinery of state, often seen as distant or inept, had finally proven its relevance in the most personal of ways. Children were the clearest symbol of this transformation. Nutrition surveys documented measurable drops in malnutrition rates. At schools participating in the new meal program, teachers described a noticeable change. Students stayed awake, engaged, and curious. Parents who once hesitated to send their children to class for lack of food found new motivation when school offered both learning and a warm bowl of fish stew. The improvement in education was not abstract, it was written in the energy of children who finally had the strength to focus. The political consequences soon followed. Opposition parties, usually quick to criticize, found their arguments blunted. How could they attack a government when markets were visibly fuller, when families were tangibly better nourished? The evidence lies on the dinner table, one commentator observed. In a country where politics often felt detached from everyday struggles, sovereignty had shifted from slogans to lived experience. The word no longer belonged only to speeches, it belonged to meals, to markets, to the rhythm of village life. The cultural impact deepened the shift. Across Burkina Faso, murals began appearing with images of fish leaping from rivers, painted alongside national flags. Folk singers wrote verses praising the return of abundance to the waters. In village festivals, fish featured not only as food but as symbols of renewal and independence. What once seemed ordinary had become political art. A tilapia could now stand for dignity, a catfish for resilience. These symbols reached people in ways statistics never could, embedding the project in the national imagination. Yet with every achievement came the shadow of risk. Citizens and officials alike knew that success could unravel if old patterns returned. Corruption remained a constant danger. Would funds for hatcheries and cooperatives be mismanaged? Would elites capture the benefits meant for communities? Environmental strain was another concern. Intensive aquaculture could pollute lakes or deplete oxygen levels if not carefully managed. Memories of failed development projects haunted the optimism, reminding people how quickly hopes could sour when systems broke down. Skeptics whispered that today's abundance could be tomorrow's collapse if vigilance faded. Still, the balance was unmistakable. For the first time in years, ordinary Burkinabe felt that sovereignty was not an abstract shield waved in international forums, but a lived reality in their homes. Sovereignty was a hot meal in a school cafeteria, a fisherman singing on his boat, a woman paying school fees with profits from smoked catfish. The state had moved from speeches to substance, and citizens responded with cautious but undeniable pride. The challenge ahead was whether that pride could be safeguarded. Could people hold leaders accountable to maintain integrity, avoid corruption, and ensure environmental sustainability? Could citizens themselves resist complacency, demanding that success be built into systems rather than fleeting moments? These questions lingered over the celebrations like uninvited guests, a reminder that sovereignty was never permanently won, but constantly renewed. Still, in late August 2025, the mood was undeniable. Families cooked fish stews, children carried lunch bowls to school, women sold fillets in markets, and fishermen returned to the rivers with songs of triumph. Politics, long detached from daily bread, was suddenly tied to it, and that connection, between plate and parliament, between river and rhetoric, marked a turning point in the nation's story. Can everyday citizens keep leaders accountable this time? Tell us below. So what does this all mean, not just for governments, but for ordinary people across Africa? Burkina Faso's $200 million fish harvest is more than a statistic. It is a statement. A landlocked country once mocked for its hunger has shown that sovereignty is not measured by borders or treaties alone, but by the power to feed its people. From school cafeterias to village markets, fish has become both food and philosophy, both dinner and diplomacy. Yet questions remain. Can this momentum survive corruption, ecological strain, or shifting politics? Or will it fade like so many bold African experiments of the past? What is certain is that ordinary Burkinabe already feel the change in their daily lives, and neighbors are watching closely. If fish can turn rivers into shields of sovereignty in Burkina Faso, what else might Africa achieve when it dares to feed itself first? What does it all mean to you? Drop your thoughts below. Your voice matters here. And if this story moved you, hit subscribe and stay with us for more.